WWE Raw is the longest-running weekly episodic television show in history, and for many of us, it's been a key part of our childhood and teenage years. From Austin spraying the corporation with beer to Cena's battles with Edge, from Evolution turning on Randy Orton to Shawn Michaels' retirement speech, for 3 decades, Monday Night Raw has given us countless moments, stories, and memories we'll never forget. In this video, we're revisiting the complete history of Raw from its origins in 1993 to the insanity of the Attitude Era, from the thrill of Ruthless Aggression to empty arena shows during the pandemic, all the way to present-day Raw. So sit back, grab some snacks, and come take a trip down memory lane as we relive the entire history of WWE Raw. Before Monday Night Raw existed, WWF's weekly television presence was built around a show called Primetime Wrestling. It was hosted by Gorilla Monsoon and Bobby Heenan, and its job was to air pre-taped matches from house shows, throw in a few interviews, and get fans excited enough to buy upcoming pay-per-views. It was fine for its time, but by the early 1990s, the format felt stale, and Vince McMahon knew it, so he started drawing up something new. He wanted a live wrestling show. The working title during development was Down Dirty Gritty Raw. Another name that briefly came up was Raw Uncooked. By the time the debut episode arrived, Vince settled on Monday Night Raw, and wrestling had its new flagship show. On January 11th, 1993, Raw went live on the USA Network for the first time. The commentary team was Vince McMahon, Randy Savage, and comedian Rob Bartlett. Sean Mooney opened things from outside the building, and then the show began. Yokozuna defeated Koko B. Ware in the opener. The Steiner brothers handled a pair of jobbers in 3 minutes. Shawn Michaels retained the Intercontinental Championship against Max Moon in the best in-ring performance of the night. And in the main event, The Undertaker, accompanied by Paul Bearer, put away Damien Demento. The show drew a 2.5 rating and proved that there was an audience willing to tune in every single Monday night. What separated Raw from everything before, it wasn't just the live format, it was the intention behind it. WWF wasn't going to use this show purely to sell pay-per-views. Storylines would advance here, title matches would happen here. Stars could be made or broken on a random Monday night, and that unpredictability was the whole point. It didn't take long for that philosophy to produce its first iconic moment. On May 17, 1993, the same episode that saw Shawn Michaels lose the Intercontinental Championship to Marty Jannetty in the first ever title change on Raw, a young, unknown kid named Sean Waltman stepped into the ring against Razor Ramon. Razor was one of the company's biggest stars at the time, dripping with cool, already positioned as a future main eventer. Waltman was supposed to be there to make him look good and take the pin. Instead, he hit a moonsault, got the 3 count, and the fans lost their mind. It was the kind of moment that could only happen on a live show, and it proved exactly what Raw was capable of delivering. But for every moment of brilliance in those early years, the company behind the show was in serious trouble. The steroid scandal that had engulfed WWF in the early 1990s left a long shadow. Vince McMahon himself had been indicted and faced trial, and while he was ultimately acquitted of all charges in 1994, the damage to the company's reputation was massive. Hulk Hogan, the single biggest drawing card WWF had ever produced, was gone. He'd departed in 1993 after his own steroid admission became part of the story, and within a year he had signed with WCW, where Ted Turner's money was waiting. Randy Savage eventually followed. Ric Flair had already gone back. WWF was watching its most valuable assets walk out the door. To fill the void, McMahon leaned hard into what became known as the New Generation Era, a roster built around Bret Hart, Shawn Michaels, The Undertaker, Razor Ramon, and Diesel. The top 10% of the card featured stars with great in-ring ability who produced must-see matches. But the bottom 90 featured one of the most cartoonishly gimmick-heavy rosters in wrestling history. There were plumbers, dentists, clowns, janitors, you name it. The presentation was colorful and aimed squarely at children, which might have worked in the late 1980s, but by the mid-1990s, it felt completely out of place with where pop culture was heading. Raw itself was struggling to maintain consistent momentum. The fully live model that Vince had envisioned from the start proved too expensive to sustain every week. So the show settled into a pattern of 1 live episode followed by 1 or 2 pre-taped episodes. The problem with that was Eric Bischoff figured it out almost immediately. When WCW launched Monday Nitro on September 4, 1995, Bischoff began exploiting Raw's pre-taped nature by announcing the results of Raw tapings on Nitro before Raw even aired. If WWF had taped a championship change 2 weeks earlier, Nitro would tell their audience before it happened. The head-to-head battle between the two shows had officially began, and early on, the two programs traded ratings wins back and forth. But by late 1995, Nitro was pulling ahead. And when Scott Hall and Kevin Nash arrived in WCW in mid-1996, followed shortly after by Hulk Hogan's earth-shattering heel turn at Bash at the Beach, the formation of the NWO changed wrestling overnight. Suddenly, WCW wasn't just competing with Raw, it was dominating it. Nitro would go on to beat Raw in the weekly ratings for 83 consecutive weeks. WWF was desperate. Ratings were low, the roster was thin on star power, and the competition wasn't going away. So they did what desperate companies sometimes do. They took a swing that nearly blew everything up. In late 1996, Raw aired a segment built around Stone Cold Steve Austin breaking into Brian Pillman's home. The idea was to blur the lines between reality and fiction in a way that had never been attempted on wrestling television. Austin arrived at Pillman's house. Pillman, visibly erratic and unhinged, grabbed a gun as the live feed cut. Parents called the USA Network in outrage. The network's VP of sports programming wanted the show pulled entirely, not just because of how real the whole thing felt, but because an unscripted F-bomb had landed on cable television in prime time. McMahon met with network executives who made it clear that a stunt like that couldn't happen again. The show survived, but it was a close call. Though the segment drew backlash from parents and network executives, it made Raw hot for a while, and Vince took notice. What came next proved that McMahon had heard every word of the warning from the network, and had decided to ignore it anyway. Raw was going to get a new edge, a new style, and a new attitude. The Pillman controversy had been a warning shot. USA Network executives had made their position clear, and for about 5 minutes, it looked like WWF was going to play it safe and clean things up. But then Vince McMahon did what he always did when backed into a corner. He threw the whole rulebook out. On February 3, 1997, Monday Night Raw expanded to 2 hours in direct response to Nitro having done the same the previous summer. And by March 10th, the show had a new name, Raw is War. The show was divided into 2 distinct blocks. The first hour, labeled Raw is War, kept things relatively tame, while the second hour, called War Zone, was where the adult-oriented content lived. The split let WWF play both sides, family-friendly programming in one slot, edgier material in the next. It was clever, calculated, and the first real sign that the company knew exactly what kind of show it wanted to become. What it wanted to become was something that felt dangerous, funny, unpredictable, and human all at once. And the engine powering that transformation was already on the roster. His name was Stone Cold Steve Austin. Austin had been rising steadily since his King of the Ring 1996 speech. But 1997 was the year he stopped being a promising mid-carder and started becoming the most impactful character in professional wrestling. His feud with Bret Hart's reformed Hart Foundation gave Raw an edge with Austin as the anti-hero versus Hart as the embittered Canadian. Their matches were hard-hitting, their promos cut deep. Meanwhile, a different kind of story was cooking in the background on Raw. Paul Bearer had been teasing a dark secret about The Undertaker for months on Raw, cryptically referencing a childhood fire and a long-lost brother. When that brother finally revealed himself at Bad Blood on October 5, 1997, interfering in the first-ever Hell in a Cell match between Undertaker and Shawn Michaels, the pyro exploded and Kane walked to the ring in a moment that stopped the world. The Big Red Machine, clad head-to-toe in red and black, was an unstoppable force who made every arena feel like something terrible was about to happen. His presence alone changed the temperature of every segment he was part of. But the moment that truly flipped the switch on the Attitude Era came not in a match, but in an interview. On November 17, 1997, 1 week after the Montreal Screwjob, where Vince McMahon orchestrated Bret Hart being screwed out of the WWF Championship at Survivor Series, McMahon sat down with Jim Ross on Raw and told the world he had done nothing wrong. He was calm, he was cold, and he made it clear that in his company, he made the rules. Bret screwed Bret, he said, and the Mr. McMahon character was born. The broadcaster who had spent years pretending to be just a commentator was now openly the villainous boss, the man pulling every string. And the December Raw that followed saw McMahon address the audience directly, promising that Raw was going to be the cure for the common show. He wasn't wrong. Raw in 1997 was already producing some of the best television in wrestling history. Austin's feud with the Harts, the complicated dynamic between Hart and Michaels, Mick Foley returning to his most violent alter ego, Cactus Jack. The locker room was deep, the storylines had consequence, and by the end of the year, it was clear that something had changed. But then came January 19, 1998. Mike Tyson appeared on Raw. The most feared man on the planet walked into a WWF arena and stood face-to-face with Stone Cold Steve Austin, who got in Tyson's face without blinking. The two had to be physically separated by security, and the segment took over mainstream headlines. People who hadn't watched wrestling in years suddenly had a reason to tune in. Tyson agreed to be the special enforcer for the WrestleMania 14 main event with Austin versus Shawn Michaels for the WWF Championship, and the build to that show became the hottest Raw had been since it launched. Austin won the title at Mania, and the night after, Raw is War began a chapter that would define the show for the next 2 years with the Austin versus McMahon feud. The boss who kept trying to control his most uncontrollable employee and the employee who kept making the boss's life a living nightmare. On April 13, 1998, Raw is War finally beat Nitro in the weekly ratings for the first time in 84 weeks with the advertised match between Austin and McMahon. From that night forward, Nitro would only win 8 more head-to-head rating battles. The war had turned. 2 weeks later came one of the most memorable moments of the entire Monday Night Wars. Both Raw and Nitro were filming in the Hampton Roads area of Virginia on the same night. Triple H loaded up the DX Army in a military convoy and drove to the Norfolk Scope, where he challenged Eric Bischoff to come outside and face them. The group tried to get fans to chant DX slogans. They attempted to enter the arena and couldn't. But the footage made it back to Raw, and when it aired, it was the wrestling equivalent of walking up to your rival's front door and ringing the bell. It was petty and brilliant and very, very effective. Meanwhile, Austin continued making Vince's life a living hell. He showed up to McMahon's hospital room in a doctor's costume and bashed him over the head with a bedpan. He drove a Zamboni to the ring and used it to get to McMahon. And on March 22, 1999, he rode a beer truck into the arena and used its hose to soak the corporation days before WrestleMania 15. By 1999, Raw was firing on all cylinders and it was one of the most watched programs on cable television. The Rock, who had spent 1997 turning from a rejected babyface into one of the most compelling heels in history, was now evolving into the most charismatic performer on the entire roster. His partnership and eventual feud with Mick Foley gave Raw some of its most electric moments. The rivalry between Austin and The Rock gave the show its beating heart, as the chaos and electricity of the two megastars colliding kept fans hooked every week. The single most watched segment in Raw history came on September 27, 1999. Mick Foley, in his Mankind persona, organized a This Is Your Life segment for The Rock, bringing out people from Rock's past, including a high school gym teacher and an old girlfriend. McMahon reportedly hated the segment while it was happening, but the audience at home loved every second of it as the quarter-hour rating for that segment hit 8.4. However, the moment that truly cemented Raw's dominance in the ratings war came on January 4, 1999. WWF had taped an episode of Raw where Mankind defeated The Rock for the WWF Championship with Austin's help. WCW found out the result and decided to announce it on Nitro in a calculated attempt to stop fans from changing the channel. Eric Bischoff told his announcers to tell viewers what was about to happen on Raw, adding sarcastically that the result was going to put some butts in the seats. And to be fair, it did, just not in the way Bischoff intended. 600,000 viewers switched from Nitro to Raw to watch Mankind win the championship. The same night, WCW presented the infamous Finger Poke of Doom. Raw aired one of the most exciting title wins the company had ever produced. The contrast couldn't have been starker. The 1999 version of Raw also brought one of the best debuts in the show's history. For weeks, a digital countdown clock had been appearing on WWF programming. On August 9, 1999, with The Rock in the ring cutting a promo, the clock hit 0 and Y2J Chris Jericho walked out and interrupted him, declaring that Raw was Jericho and that he had come to save the company. The Rock, being The Rock, immediately went to work verbally dismantling him, but Jericho held his ground. The company put a new talent to test with one of the biggest stars in the company and let the audience decide if they can keep up. In Jericho's case, he absolutely could. But that same year delivered one of Raw's most human episodes. Owen Hart died on May 23, 1999, after an equipment malfunction during his entrance at the Over the Edge pay-per-view. The following night's Raw, which became known as Raw is Owen, was a tribute show unlike anything the company had aired before. Throughout the night, wrestler after wrestler gave their honest thoughts on Owen and shared stories and memories that reminded everyone of the reality of the wrestling business. The night ended with Austin toasting Owen and leaving a beer can in the ring. As 2000 arrived, the Attitude Era was at full speed. Steve Austin had gone in for neck surgery and would miss most of the year. Losing the company's biggest star could have been catastrophic. Instead, The Rock stepped fully into the main event picture and proved he was every bit Austin's equal in terms of drawing power. Triple H had married Stephanie McMahon in a wild storyline, and the McMahon-Helmsley era took over Raw in 2000. The love triangle between Triple H, Stephanie, and Kurt Angle was one of the better layered soap opera storylines Raw had run, and the show was drawing enormous numbers. On the other side, by early 2001, WCW was dying. The NWO angle had long since lost its novelty. The company tried everything from celebrity involvement to second-generation wrestlers and bled money in the process. AOL Time Warner, which had inherited WCW through a corporate merger, had no interest in keeping it running. In March 2001, Vince McMahon purchased WCW and marked the end of the Monday Night Wars, with Vince standing alone as the undisputed king of professional wrestling. Raw had gone from fighting for its life against Nitro in 1996 to watching its rival fold completely just 5 years later. The show that had once been taped in high school gyms to save money was now the most watched program on cable every Monday night. The Attitude Era had done something no one in 1996 would have believed possible. It had made Monday Night Raw the most culturally relevant show in wrestling history. But winning the war came with a cost nobody had fully anticipated. Without competition, the pressure to be great every single week suddenly disappeared. And Raw needed that pressure more than anyone realized. What followed was a period of highs and lows, with old stars departing, new stars arriving, and Raw continuing to be wild and unpredictable. The first major structural change came with the brand split in the summer of 2002. WWE's roster had grown enormous from years of absorbing WCW and ECW talent, and the decision was made to divide it between Raw and SmackDown, with each show operating as its own entity with exclusive talent, exclusive titles, and separate creative directions. Eric Bischoff, the same man who had been Vince McMahon's chief rival during the Monday Night Wars, was installed as Raw's on-screen general manager. Bischoff's first major act was reintroducing the World Heavyweight Championship, reviving WCW's big gold belt as Raw's exclusive title. The decision to create a new world title for Raw made sense, but what made less sense was how they gave it away. Rather than holding a tournament or staging a match, Bischoff simply handed the title to Triple H in September 2002. And with that, what would become known as Triple H's reign of terror began. Between 2002 and 2005, Triple H held the World Heavyweight Championship for a combined 616 days across multiple reigns. The problem wasn't that Triple H was champion. The problem was that he held the title at the direct expense of almost everyone else on the roster. Rob Van Dam, who had been one of the most organically overperformers in WWE, was fed to him early. Booker T built an emotionally charged feud with Triple H heading into WrestleMania 19 with the crowd fully behind him, and then lost clean in a baffling booking decision. Scott Steiner, Goldberg, and others all came and went without any lasting elevation. The result was a Raw that had the right villain but kept running out of heroes for him to face. To protect the championship picture, Triple H surrounded himself with Evolution, a faction that also included Ric Flair, Randy Orton, and Batista. The group dominated Raw for the better part of 2 years, controlling the main event scene with an iron grip. But within Evolution were the seeds of its own destruction. However, before we get to the self-destruction of Evolution, we need to talk about two powerhouses who dominated Raw during this period. First came Kane. The Big Red Machine had spent years behind his mask, and on June 23, 2003, he lost a title shot against Triple H under a stipulation that forced him to remove it if he failed. When the mask came off on live television, Kane turned on his tag team partner Rob Van Dam and transformed into a more psychologically unhinged version of the character. A monster who no longer hid behind anything. The unmasking changed the dynamic of Kane's character and turned Raw into a horror show. He attacked everyone from Jim Ross to Austin to Linda McMahon, and the Big Red Machine was the most terrifying person on the roster. Then there was Goldberg, the man who had dominated WCW in the late 90s and arrived on Raw in 2003. His spear hit like a car crash. His jackhammer was still devastating. Over the following months, he ripped through the roster, defeating The Rock, building toward an inevitable collision with Triple H for the World Heavyweight Championship. He won the title in November 2003 before losing it back to Triple H at Armageddon, and his first WWE run ultimately ended at WrestleMania 20 in a controversial match against Brock Lesnar, where both men were leaving the company and the MSG crowd made absolutely no secret of how they felt about it. Shawn Michaels also returned to in-ring competition and had a heated feud against Triple H. The NWO arrived with much hype, but couldn't recapture the magic of their glory days, with Hogan eventually turning face after his feud against The Rock. Meanwhile, Evolution's internal fractures were generating the best stories on the show. Randy Orton won the World Heavyweight Championship from Chris Benoit at SummerSlam 2004, and Triple H turned on him immediately because the game couldn't tolerate a new star holding his title. The cerebral assassin reclaimed the title from Orton and kicked him out of the group, but then Batista began to rise. The animal had been the enforcer of evolution, the muscle who didn't say much but hit hard. As 2005 began, he won the Royal Rumble and had to make a decision: go to SmackDown and challenge their champion JBL, or stay on Raw and face Triple H. On February 21, 2005, in one of the most satisfying Raw moments of the era, Batista overheard Triple H plotting to manipulate him into going to SmackDown to avoid a direct challenge. When the moment came, Batista looked Triple H dead in the eyes, gave him a thumbs down, flattened him with a Batista bomb, and made it clear he was staying on Raw and taking the title. The crowd response was enormous. The angle worked because it had been built over months, and because fans had been waiting for someone to stand up to Triple H. Batista defeated Triple H at WrestleMania 21 to win the World Heavyweight Championship. The reign of terror was over. Batista remained the face of Monday nights for 2 months, but on June 6, 2005, Raw got its new face when John Cena was drafted from SmackDown. Cena had already won the WWE Championship on SmackDown, but his arrival on Raw was positioned as the beginning of a new era for the show, and in many ways, it was. Cena was the first genuine face of the company since The Rock had stepped back, and his polarizing effect on the audience gave Raw a live wire tension every single week because you never quite knew how an arena was going to respond to him. His rivalry with Edge defined the latter half of 2006. Edge had reinvented himself as the ultimate opportunist, who used every advantage available to him, including a real-life relationship with Lita that resulted in a heated feud with Matt Hardy. The two clashed repeatedly over the WWE Championship in matches that ranged from entertaining to outright violent, with Edge constantly finding new ways to cost Cena the title and Cena constantly finding ways to overcome him. Edge invaded Cena's home and slapped his dad. Cena attacked Edge in a hotel room, and the segment where Edge and Lita celebrated their relationship drew a 5.2 rating, the highest Raw had received in a year. After his feud versus Edge, Cena got into a feud with Randy Orton, who had evolved into the Legend Killer. Their rivalry dominated most of 2007, with Orton making things personal and Cena refusing to give up. However, while all of this unfolded on the screen, Eddie Guerrero tragically passed away in 2005, and the company aired one of the most emotional tribute shows in Raw history. The night opened with a 10-bell salute to the Latino Heat, and the show featured several WWE stars sharing their memories of Eddie one last time. On the lighter side of things, Triple H and Shawn Michaels had reunited as D-Generation X, and Raw had a solid act that kept the upper mid-card strong. DX spent the summer and fall antagonizing Vince McMahon, Shane McMahon, Big Show, and the Spirit Squad in a series of segments that drew big ratings. Their Hell in a Cell match against the McMahons at Unforgiven was brutal, and it was exactly the kind of programming Raw could always fall back on when the main event scene needed a break. Through 2007, the Intercontinental Championship became one of the more interesting stories on Raw. Jeff Hardy had returned to the company and was being positioned as a high-flying underdog challenger to Umaga's brutal dominance of the mid-card. But 2007 also produced the two most jarring moments in Raw's history, one in fiction, one in devastating reality. On June 11, 2007, Vince McMahon walked to his limousine after a Raw taping, climbed inside, and the vehicle exploded in a fireball on live television. The entire premise was building toward McMahon eventually revealing he had faked his own passing. A months-long whodunit mystery that was supposed to be one of the biggest storylines of 2007. However, 14 days later, the angle was quietly buried after a real-life tragedy. On June 25th, the bodies of Chris Benoit, his wife Nancy, and their son Daniel were found at their home in Georgia. The full, horrifying details of what had happened emerged as that Monday's Raw was going on air. The show, originally planned as a tribute episode for McMahon's character, was converted in real time into a tribute to Benoit, with Vince McMahon hosting from an empty arena. As the broadcast continued, more information came out about what Benoit had done, and WWE found itself in the impossible position of having already aired hours of tribute content before the full picture was known. It also accelerated a decision that had already been under consideration for a while. On July 22, 2008, Monday Night Raw changed its rating from TV-14 to TV-PG. No more blood, no more explicit language, no more content that couldn't air in front of a 10-year-old without their parent reaching for the remote. New sponsorships with companies like Mattel and Pepsi followed almost immediately. The show invested $20 million in transitioning to full high definition. The business logic was sound, but for the fans who had grown up watching Austin terrorize his boss or Undertaker kidnap Stephanie McMahon, Raw suddenly felt like a completely different program. Whether that was a problem or just an evolution depended entirely on who you asked. What wasn't debatable was that the version of Raw entering 2009 looked nothing like the one that had ruled Monday nights a decade earlier. What followed were challenging years with Raw struggling to rebuild its identity. The PG transition in 2008 changed Monday Night Raw more than anything in a decade. The audience was still there, but the show felt like it was operating under a different set of rules. The question heading into 2009 wasn't whether Raw would survive the change. It was whether it could find anything interesting enough to replace what it had given up. For a while, it actually did, and it came from an unlikely source. Randy Orton had spent years as an unreliable figure on Raw, talented but erratic, capable of brilliance and capable of complete disengagement. In early 2009, he transformed from the Legend Killer into the Viper. Armed with his finishing punt kick and backed by his faction legacy, Orton declared war on the entire McMahon family. He punted Vince McMahon on live television after refusing to apologize for calling Stephanie worthless. He punted Shane McMahon when he tried to avenge his father. He RKO'd Stephanie. He turned the flagship show's founding family into his personal targets, and the sheer audacity of it gave Raw a dangerous villain during a period when the show felt rather tame. The feud escalated into a full-blown war involving Triple H, who broke into Orton's home with a sledgehammer in one of the era's wilder moments, only for Legacy to retaliate by tying Triple H to the ropes and Orton kissing Stephanie. The eventual collision at WrestleMania 25 was somewhat anticlimactic, but the build had been some of the best story work Raw had produced in years. And it overlapped with one of the show's most relentless ongoing rivalries, John Cena versus Randy Orton, which ran through 2009 with title changes, Iron Man matches, and Hell in a Cell encounters that together gave Raw one of its most defining stories of this period. But it was also during this period that WWE launched one of the most universally mocked experiments in the show's history. In the summer of 2009, the guest host era began as Raw would feature a celebrity guest host every single week. The idea was to generate mainstream interest by bringing in recognizable names from outside wrestling and letting them run the show for a night. What followed was a parade of celebrities with varying degrees of enthusiasm for the product. Bob Barker, Shaquille O'Neal, William Shatner. The list went on for a full year. Some guests brought genuine energy. Most treated the appearance as a promotional stop for whatever project they were currently selling. The audience tolerated it because the wrestling underneath was still happening, but the guest host era became a running joke almost immediately. The experiment ran until June 2010 before quietly being discontinued. What replaced it was far more dangerous. On June 7, 2010, 8 wrestlers wearing matching black armbands poured out from the crowd simultaneously. They dismantled everyone at ringside. They tore apart the ring itself. They took out John Cena and even the announcers. By the time it was over, the ringside area looked like a hurricane had passed through it, and the arena was absolutely silent with shock. The Nexus had arrived. Led by Wade Barrett, winner of NXT Season 1, the group was built on a concept that felt fresh. These were rookies who had been chewed up and spat out by WWE's developmental system, and they had decided to fight back collectively. The group immediately became Raw's dominant story heading into SummerSlam and beyond, with Barrett forcing Cena to join the Nexus later in the year under threat of termination. The follow-through, unfortunately, could not do justice to the hype created by the debut. The Nexus were positioned as unstoppable forces on Monday nights, then gradually chipped away at pay-per-view after pay-per-view until the threat dissipated entirely. By early 2011, WWE rebranded them as the New Nexus, which itself faded within months. The window for the Nexus to reach their ceiling came and went without WWE ever fully committing to what they had started. Complicating the picture further was the anonymous Raw general manager, a laptop computer set up at ringside through which an unseen authority figure would send emails that Michael Cole would read aloud. The concept was tolerable for the first few weeks, but the anonymous GM dragged on for over a year without resolution. It represented exactly the kind of half-formed idea that Raw kept reaching for during this period. Intriguing setup with no follow-through. But then, on June 27, 2011, everything changed. After the main event of that night's Raw featuring John Cena, CM Punk walked to the top of the entrance ramp, sat down cross-legged with a microphone, and began talking. What followed was 6 minutes of television that nobody in the building, or watching at home, was entirely prepared for. Punk called John Cena a corporate prop. He accused Vince McMahon of surrounding himself with yes-men. He mentioned Ring of Honor and New Japan Pro Wrestling by name on WWE television. He called out McMahon's idiotic daughter and doofus son-in-law. He referenced Paul Heyman and Brock Lesnar. He said his contract was expiring and he was going to walk out the door with the WWE Championship. And then his microphone was cut while he was mocking WWE's anti-bullying campaign. It was the most unfiltered promo delivered on Raw since the Attitude Era. The Pipebomb, as it became known, spread across the internet overnight and brought back a significant number of lapsed fans. The weeks that followed were some of the hottest Raw had been in years, with Punk winning the title from Cena in his hometown of Chicago at Money in the Bank and then disappearing with the belt as promised. When he returned, the resulting summer of Punk gave the show unpredictability for the first time in a long while. By Survivor Series 2011, Punk had won the championship again and began what would become a 434-day title reign. He turned heel at Raw 1000 in July 2012 by attacking The Rock, and spent the remainder of his run feuding with everyone from Ryback to John Cena in matches that consistently delivered. Through all of this, a bigger story involving three legends was brewing on Raw, and it ran across 4 consecutive WrestleManias. Shawn Michaels was the showstopper. The Undertaker held the most coveted streak in wrestling. The build to their match at WrestleMania 25 saw HBK outsmart the Deadman on every step of the way. Their match at Mania was so extraordinary that even Vince McMahon reportedly called it the greatest he had ever seen live. The two men pushed each other to the limit, and when Undertaker finally covered Michaels for the 3 count, fans knew they'd witnessed something special. And then came the fallout. Michaels got obsessed with getting a rematch against The Undertaker, who kept denying Michaels a second chance. In retaliation, Michaels cost Taker the World Heavyweight Championship at Elimination Chamber. At WrestleMania 26, with Michaels putting his career on the line for one more shot at ending the streak, when Undertaker hit the tombstone and Michaels couldn't kick out, HBK's career was officially over. The next night on Raw, Michaels gave his emotional retirement speech with Taker coming out to tip his hat and Triple H hugging his best friend. But the streak wasn't done providing drama. WrestleMania 27 saw Triple H trying to avenge HBK's loss in a no-holds-barred match that left Undertaker so physically broken he had to be helped from the ring after winning. WrestleMania 28 delivered the end of an era match, Triple H versus Undertaker inside Hell in a Cell with Shawn Michaels as special referee. The build took place on Raw, with the history between all 3 men adding emotional stakes to the match. The other main event story of 2012 was a year in the making. At WrestleMania 28, John Cena and The Rock finally collided in a match that had been announced a full year in advance. The build saw Rock and Cena verbally destroy each other on the mic week after week, as 2 of the biggest stars in WWE history were set to collide on the grandest stage. Raw also saw 2 developments in 2012 that would shape the next several years of the show. First, on April 2nd, the Raw after WrestleMania 28, Brock Lesnar returned to WWE for the first time since 2004. His music hit, the crowd erupted, and he immediately F5'd John Cena to announce his presence with maximum force. The Beast had returned. Also during this period, Raw went through one of its most turbulent periods, with the brand split coming to an end and Raw becoming Raw Super Show with John Laurinaitis as the general manager. Raw 1000 itself was one of the best episodes in the show's history, with the reunion of DX, the wedding segment between Daniel Bryan and AJ Lee, and planting the seeds for CM Punk versus The Rock. However, in November 2012, 3 men in matching tactical gear debuted at Survivor Series and made their mark on Raw, laying waste to everyone in the ring. They introduced themselves eventually as The Shield: Seth Rollins, Dean Ambrose, and Roman Reigns. The Shield's arrival in late 2012 gave Raw fresh energy, as the group felt dangerous, cohesive, and impossible to ignore. But as The Shield became the dominant faction on Raw through 2013 by destroying everyone from Kane to The Undertaker, another story was quietly building alongside them that would consume the show completely. Daniel Bryan had been quietly over with audiences for years. Small in frame by WWE standards, technically brilliant, and armed with a "yes" chant that had been completely hijacked by crowds who found it irresistible, Bryan was the rare performer who connected with every kind of wrestling fan. The casual viewer loved the chant. The serious fan loved the ring work. And by mid-2013, the arenas were telling WWE something the company seemed determined not to hear. They wanted Daniel Bryan at the top of the card. SummerSlam 2013 was where the story truly ignited. Bryan defeated John Cena for the WWE Championship in a match that shocked people with its quality and its clean result. And then, immediately after the bell, Triple H, who had served as special referee, leveled Bryan with a pedigree, while Randy Orton walked down with his Money in the Bank briefcase and cashed in on the beaten champion. The Authority had arrived as Raw's new ruling villains, and their explicit mission was to deny Daniel Bryan what the crowd had decided he deserved. What followed was one of the longest instances of storytelling Raw had produced since the Attitude Era. Every week, Bryan would find a way to get close to the championship picture. Every week, Triple H and Stephanie McMahon would find a new way to block him. They called him a B-plus player. They put him into situations designed to humiliate him. They appointed Randy Orton as the face of WWE and had him carry the title while Bryan was systematically kept away from the title. And every single week, audiences responded with louder yes chants and more passionate rejection of the Authority. Raw after WrestleMania 29 also gave us one of the loudest crowd reactions in the show's history as Dolph Ziggler cashed in his Money in the Bank briefcase on Alberto Del Rio and became World Heavyweight Champion. On the same night, Ryback, who had been booked as a dominant babyface throughout 2012, turned heel by attacking John Cena and got a brief push in the main event. The arrival of the Wyatt family in July 2013 added a different texture to Raw's landscape. Bray Wyatt, accompanied by Luke Harper and Eric Rowan, debuted with a series of eerie vignettes before emerging on TV as an unsettling character who blended cult leader charisma with physical menace. Where the Shield operated like a military unit, the Wyatts felt like something crawled out of a swamp. The collision between these two factions was inevitable, and it finally arrived at the Elimination Chamber pay-per-view in February 2014. The Wyatts got the win. The Shield's superior team chemistry ultimately gave them the long-term edge, but the feud accomplished what good wrestling should. It elevated everyone involved and left audiences wanting more from all six men. Then, on June 2, 2014, one night after the Shield had beaten Evolution in a decisive victory at Payback, the ground shifted. Seth Rollins, while Ambrose and Reigns had their backs turned, grabbed a steel chair and cracked both of his brothers across the back. He turned heel and walked to Triple H's side, aligning with the Authority. The Shield was over. The betrayal landed with enormous force precisely because the Shield had been positioned as an unbreakable unit for 18 months. Rollins didn't just break the faction, he broke the hearts of the fans who had genuinely invested in the trio, which made the resulting anger at him completely organic. Ambrose's pursuit of Rollins through the summer and fall of 2014 gave Raw a wildcard element it hadn't had in a while. The feud was scrappy, unpredictable, and entertaining in ways that felt different from the polished main event stories running alongside it. It never quite got the elevated platform it deserved, but as a mid-card war, it was easily one of the year's better executed stories. Meanwhile, the Daniel Bryan saga reached its conclusion at WrestleMania 30 in New Orleans, but Bryan's moment at the top was tragically short. A series of neck injuries forced him to surrender the title in May 2014, and then a concussion diagnosis kept him off television for months, and then retirement claims began circulating. The Yes Movement's hero had been chewed up by the physical demands of the business almost immediately after reaching its peak. His absence created a vacuum that Raw filled with varying degrees of success. Rollins, armed with his Money in the Bank briefcase, became the most consistent main event performer on the show through 2014 and into 2015. A calculating, athletically brilliant heel who carried Authority gold while constantly looking over his shoulder for the next threat. His title reign began at WrestleMania 31 in the most dramatic fashion possible. Mid-match between Roman Reigns and Brock Lesnar, he sprinted down and cashed in on both exhausted competitors, pinning Reigns in the chaos to become champion. After this, Rollins defended the title against everyone from Orton to Sting to Ambrose in a series of matches that ranged from excellent to instant classics. Alongside Rollins, John Cena's 2015 United States Championship run gave Raw some of its best mid-card television in years. Cena issued an open challenge every single week. Any performer on the roster could step up and try to take the title. The concept produced matches with Sami Zayn, Neville, Cesaro, Kevin Owens, and others that consistently over-delivered and gave the secondary championship prestige. Owens in particular used his Raw appearances during this period as an extended audition for main event status, brawling with Cena in a series of matches that announced him as a legit star at the highest level. Brock Lesnar, meanwhile, was functioning as the part-time champion, appearing a handful of times per year, demolishing whoever stood across from him, and generating enormous crowd responses that highlighted the problem Raw had with the rest of its roster. If a giant reaction required Lesnar or Cena to generate it, what did that say about the performers on the show week in and week out? That question pointed directly at the most polarizing push of the era. Roman Reigns had been positioned as the company's chosen next face since early 2014. And by late 2015, the push had become the central tension between WWE and its own audience. Reigns was athletically gifted, physically imposing, and visually every inch a top star. The problem was the way he was being presented. Scripted promos that sounded boring, booking that put him in dominant positions before he had earned them, and a complete misreading of what the audience actually responded to. The crowds that had cheered CM Punk for years, that had demanded Daniel Bryan main event WrestleMania, were not going to simply accept a product of nepotism and call it earned. And so Reigns became the most polarizing figure of this era. The conversation around Reigns consumed Raw's post-show discussion every single week through the end of 2015 when he finally won the WWE Championship. Whether fans accepted it or resisted it, Roman Reigns was now carrying the flagship. This era of Raw also saw the Divas get a larger platform with the arrival of stars like Becky Lynch, Charlotte Flair, and Sasha Banks on Raw, along with established names like the Bella Twins and Paige. With a brand split looming on the horizon, Raw was heading into 2016 with its identity more contested than it had been since the lean years of the mid-1990s. The brand split of 2016 arrived at exactly the right time. WWE's roster was the deepest it had been in years, partly because NXT had spent half a decade producing the next generation of talent, and partly because the company had been stockpiling performers without giving many of them meaningful stories. Splitting Raw and SmackDown into separate entities with separate rosters, championships, and creative directions forced the company to actually use what it had. In mid-2016, Vince McMahon appeared on Raw to announce that Stephanie McMahon would serve as Raw's commissioner, with Mick Foley installed as its general manager. SmackDown got Shane McMahon and Daniel Bryan. The draft followed on July 19th with Roman Reigns, Sasha Banks, Chris Jericho, Kevin Owens, Seth Rollins, Finn, Charlotte Flair, and Braun Strowman all landing on the red brand. SmackDown took AJ Styles, Dean Ambrose, John Cena, and The Miz, among others. For the first time in years, both shows had rosters worth watching, and the competition between them brought genuine energy back to Monday nights. Raw's first major accomplishment under the new format was creating a new world championship. With Ambrose taking the WWE title to SmackDown, the red brand needed its own title. Stephanie McMahon and Mick Foley introduced the ugly-looking Universal Championship, and a tournament to crown its first holder gave Raw a shot of adrenaline. The tournament concluded with the Demon King defeating Seth Rollins at SummerSlam to become the inaugural champion. The reaction was enormous. Finn had gone from NXT to the top of Raw's championship picture in a matter of weeks, and the Demon King had arrived as a main event player. But 24 hours later, he was gone. A shoulder injury sustained during the SummerSlam match forced Finn to relinquish the title on the following Raw. It was a deflating development that left a hole at the top of the card before the new title had even had time to establish itself. Kevin Owens won the subsequent match to become Universal Champion, but not before Triple H made his presence felt, laying out Rollins with the pedigree to help Owens pick up the win, instantly turning Rollins into a sympathetic babyface chasing revenge against his former mentor. That revenge chase gave Raw its most consistent storyline through late 2016 and into early 2017. Their eventual WrestleMania 33 match was fought under unsanctioned rules and delivered everything the months of build had promised. Running alongside it was the best comedy pairing Raw had produced in years. Kevin Owens and Chris Jericho became inseparable from the moment Owens took the Universal title, building a friendship around petty grievances, lists, and an unshakable chemistry that the live crowds adored. The list of Jericho became the show's most reliable weekly laugh. However, the whole thing exploded on February 13, 2017, with the Festival of Friendship, an elaborate in-ring tribute to everything the two had built together. Owens presented Jericho with a custom list, and then, with Jericho reading it, Owens put him down with a vicious attack. Fans saw the betrayal coming from miles away, and it still landed with full force because the comedy that had surrounded the friendship had been so genuine that the moment felt like a deep connection had been destroyed. It remains one of the better executed friendship breakups Raw has produced in the modern era. But while the Rollins and Owens stories gave Raw its narrative core, the show's most physically dominant story in 2017 belonged to Braun Strowman. The monster among men had been quietly building for a year, tearing through opponents with a ferocity that made the live crowds react to him the way they hadn't reacted to a big man since Goldberg's first run. His feud with Roman Reigns through the spring and summer of 2017 was built entirely on violence. Strowman dismantling Reigns backstage on an episode of Raw and then tipping over an ambulance with Reigns strapped to a gurney inside it was one of the most talked about Raw moments of the year. Their series of encounters through the summer established Strowman as a legit main event force, even if his path to the Universal title was perpetually blocked by Brock Lesnar's gravitational pull on the championship. Lesnar had won the Universal title at WrestleMania 33 from Goldberg, a rematch from their encounter at Survivor Series 2016. and immediately retreated into part-time status. For the better part of 2 years, the Universal Championship was physically absent from Raw most weeks, appearing only when Lesnar chose to return. The title lost the prestige a weekly championship needs to maintain, and the show suffered for it. Kurt Angle, who had replaced Mick Foley as Raw's general manager, was a popular addition as an on-screen character, but couldn't fix the structural problem of Raw's top prize being held by a performer who showed up 3 times a year. The 7-man gauntlet match on the February 26, 2018 edition of Raw, featuring Strowman, Roman Reigns, Seth Rollins, Cena, Finn, Elias, and The Miz, gave the show one of its finest standalone episodes in years. Rollins opened the match, lasted the longest, and had the crowd on their feet with a performance that felt surreal. He didn't win, but the night reminded everyone exactly what he was capable of when given space to work. The Shield reunited multiple times through 2017 and 2018 in bursts of nostalgia that the crowds always received warmly, even when the reunions felt temporary. The most emotionally significant one came in October 2018 when Roman Reigns, standing in the ring after announcing his leukemia had returned and he was relinquishing the Universal Championship, was flanked by Rollins and Ambrose for one last moment of brotherhood before stepping away. It was one of the most human Raw moments in years. And then, on the same night, Ambrose turned on Rollins after the two won the Raw Tag Team Championships together. The heel turn had been anticipated for months. Choosing that specific night to execute it gave it an extra dimension of bitter irony that made it impactful. Unfortunately, Ambrose's heel run never found its footing. The character was poorly written, the feud with Rollins lacked the intensity such a personal betrayal demanded, and by early 2019, it was clear Ambrose had made his decision to leave when his contract expired in April. His final months on Raw were wasted in forgettable angles, a short-lived Shield reunion, and when he departed for AEW as Jon Moxley. The contrast between how WWE had used him in his last year and how he immediately flourished in a new environment was impossible to ignore. The year of 2018 also marked the 25 years anniversary of Raw, and the company celebrated it with the Raw 25 episode that took place in 2 separate venues and featured a DX reunion along with other legends like Stone Cold and The Undertaker making an appearance. After the highs and lows of 2018, 2019 was a difficult year for Raw across the board. The creative decisions piled up in ways that tested even the most patient long-term fans. WWE had announced a wildcard rule that allowed Raw stars to appear on SmackDown and vice versa. Roman Reigns returned from his leukemia battle and was immediately placed in a months-long mystery angle where someone was apparently trying to harm him backstage. Baron Corbin spent the year as the primary antagonist for both Reigns and Seth Rollins, a casting choice that consistently deflated whatever momentum the babyfaces had generated. The Lana, Rusev, and Bobby Lashley love triangle, with Lana announcing on live television that she was leaving Rusev for Lashley, followed by weeks of uncomfortable segments, was exactly the kind of content that drove away the very audience Raw needed to retain. But if you thought that storyline was bad, the Maria Kanellis angle and Ric Flair's alliance with Lacey Evans produced some of the worst segments in the show's long history. But there were bright spots too, like The Fiend. Bray Wyatt had spent 2019 rebuilding his character through a brilliantly crafted series of segments called The Firefly Funhouse, a puppet show-style pre-taped presentation where a cheerful version of Wyatt interacted with cartoonish characters while slowly revealing the darker entity living beneath the surface. When The Fiend finally debuted in ring at SummerSlam, it felt like WWE had finally found a new special attraction that could fill the void left by the absence of names like Kane and The Undertaker. The months that followed only built the mystique higher. But then came Hell in a Cell. Rollins and The Fiend headlined the pay-per-view in a match that neither man could logically lose. Rollins was the reigning Universal Champion, and The Fiend had been built as essentially unstoppable. The solution WWE settled on was to have the referee stop the match after Rollins used a sledgehammer in what was supposed to be a no disqualification match. The crowd reacted with a chorus of boos and chants demanding their money back. The Fiend's aura, built so carefully over months, took an immediate hit it never fully recovered from. It was the perfect symbol for Raw at the end of 2019, a show with the right assets, surrounded by baffling decisions that undermined them at every turn. But while 2019 was bad, 2020 was about to bring a completely different challenge for the company with the pandemic era. The first Raw of the pandemic era arrived from an empty performance center in Orlando, Florida, with the announce team sitting at ringside and a hollow silence where the crowd noise used to be. What followed was one of the strangest years in the show's history. Drew McIntyre had won the Royal Rumble in January in Houston in front of tens of thousands of fans, pointing at the WrestleMania sign to a genuine roar. By the time he got to his WrestleMania moment, the building was an empty gym with cameras in it. He defeated Brock Lesnar in 5 minutes to win the WWE Championship, stood on the turnbuckle to celebrate the win, but his coronation felt hollow. For the next year, Raw was built around McIntyre as champion and the various threats that emerged to challenge him. His feud with Seth Rollins, who had transformed into the Monday Night Messiah, a cult leader character who gathered a group of disciples and positioned himself as Raw's righteous savior, gave 2020's early pandemic shows their most consistent story, with Rollins delivering compelling promo work that suited the eerie quietness of the empty arena setting. Later came Bobby Lashley, who had aligned with the Hurt Business faction and was steadily building the physical menace that would eventually make him one of Raw's most credible main eventers. Dolph Ziggler challenged for the title multiple times with a heel character that played surprisingly well in the sterile environment. But the most effective story Raw told in 2020 was Randy Orton's return to his legend killer persona. Orton had spent early 2020 targeting Edge following the latter's surprise return at the Royal Rumble. When Edge suffered an injury in their Backlash match, Orton pivoted to an extended legend-killing spree that gave Raw some of its most talked-about moments of the year. He attacked Ric Flair, he targeted Christian, he punted Shawn Michaels, and in one deeply silly yet weirdly effective segment, he disguised himself as a janitor, put on night vision goggles, crept into the Legends Lounge backstage, and turned the lights off before systematically destroying 4 legends in the dark. The image of Orton in night vision goggles became an immediate meme, but the underlying brutality of what he was doing made his feud with McIntyre feel intense by the time SummerSlam arrived. Raw also experimented with a pair of concepts in 2020 that fell somewhere between interesting and completely bizarre. Raw Underground debuted in August with Shane McMahon hosting what was presented as an underground fight club where wrestlers competed in submission and brawling-style matches outside the usual structure. The concept had potential in theory and generated curiosity for a few weeks before the reality of production limitations and pandemic restrictions made it impossible to sustain. It was shelved after 8 weeks and never mentioned again. Retribution arrived around the same time, a masked group that attacked Raw's production equipment, destroyed monitors and vehicles, and generated intrigue through mysterious vignettes. The unmasking of the members, who turned out to be lesser-known developmental talents, deflated the angle almost instantly and confirmed that sometimes the mystery is better than the answer. By August 2020, WWE had developed the Thunderdome concept, running from Amway Center in Orlando and later Tropicana Field in St. Petersburg, with thousands of LED screens surrounding the arena displaying virtual fans who could be seen reacting in real time. It wasn't the same as a real crowd, but it was unmistakably better than silence. When fans finally returned to Raw in the summer of 2021, the response was overwhelming. Raw's first fully attended shows back on the road felt electric in a way that the show hadn't for years, simply because the live ingredient had been absent long enough for everyone to miss it. Big E's Money in the Bank cash-in on the September 13th, 2021 Raw captured that energy perfectly. He had won the briefcase in front of a roaring live audience at the pay-per-view weeks earlier, and when the moment came to use it, sprinting to the ring, cashing in on a downed Bobby Lashley, winning the WWE Championship for the first time in his career, the arena responded like a celebration everyone had been waiting for. It remains one of the most joyful Raw moments of the decade. This era also saw Becky Lynch announcing her pregnancy on Raw, the return of Gillberg, and the 24/7 title chaos. The pandemic era, for all its weirdness and creative dead ends, produced something unexpectedly valuable. A new appreciation for what live wrestling crowds actually do for a show. Raw came out the other side of it knowing exactly what it had almost lost. But as the calendar turned to 2022, Raw was about to write a new chapter. The single most important event in Raw's recent history happened not in a ring, but in a boardroom. In July 2022, following a Wall Street Journal investigation into allegations of misconduct, Vince McMahon resigned as WWE's chairman. Triple H, who had recently recovered from a serious heart condition, was handed creative control of the company. Within weeks, talent that McMahon had released or sidelined began returning. Karrion Kross, Dakota Kai, Bray Wyatt, and Braun Strowman all came back. But WWE's most important story through 2022 and into 2023 wasn't on the red brand at all. It was the Bloodline saga on SmackDown. Roman Reigns and his ever-expanding family unit dominated that show, with Raw catching the overflow when major Bloodline players appeared on Mondays with segments like the Tribal Court. What Raw did have as its own defining story was one that arrived at WrestleMania 38 in April 2022, when Seth Rollins stood in the ring waiting for his mystery opponent, and Cody Rhodes stepped inside a WWE ring for the first time in 6 years. Rhodes had left WWE in 2016 as the face-painted mid-card act Stardust, spent those years building AEW into a legitimate competitor, and co-founded a company that changed professional wrestling's landscape. And now he was back, looking every inch the main event star WWE had never allowed him to be. Rhodes defeated Rollins that night, and again at WrestleMania Backlash, and then, with his pectoral muscle torn completely off the bone in the days leading up to their third match, wrestled Seth Rollins inside Hell in a Cell with bruising covering half his chest that became one of the most talked about images in wrestling in years. He won that match too, going 3-0 in their series before the injury shelved him for 8 months. The performance was extraordinary and transformed Rhodes into the most compelling babyface figure the company had produced since the peak years of The Shield. Meanwhile, Raw's roster was also home to the Judgment Day, a faction that Edge had founded at WrestleMania 38 as a dark gothic heel group, then been immediately removed from when Finn joined and turned on him alongside Rhea Ripley and Damian Priest. The stable rebuilt itself without Edge, adopted a no-leadership structure, and became Raw's dominant faction over the following years through a series of well-executed developments. The most impactful was Dominic Mysterio's turn on his father Rey at Clash at the Castle in September 2022, choosing to join the Judgment Day, becoming one of the most despised heels on the roster while simultaneously generating some of the most entertaining content alongside Rhea Ripley. Ripley and Priest both won world championships in subsequent years as the faction's profile grew, and J.D. McDonough and various others rotated in and out as the group's composition evolved through 2023 and 2024. Meanwhile, Seth Rollins spent 2023 as Raw's undisputed workhorse champion. After being crowned the inaugural World Heavyweight Champion following a tournament victory over AJ Styles, he spent the rest of the year defending it against anyone the show threw at him: Finn, Nakamura, McIntyre, Damian Priest, while wrestling with a fractured lumbar spine through the fall and refusing to take time off. Leading into Survivor Series 2023, the main story on Raw centered around Rollins and Rhodes joining forces to take on the Judgment Day. Randy Orton made his much-awaited return on the show, joined the babyfaces, and hit one of the most beautiful RKOs of all time. The same night, CM Punk also made his return in his hometown of Chicago. Punk immediately got into a feud with Seth Rollins that would be delayed for a year after the voice of the voiceless suffered an injury at the Royal Rumble. Meanwhile, Drew McIntyre replaced Punk as Rollins' WrestleMania 40 opponent, mocking Punk and taking the credit for injuring him at WrestleMania. McIntyre won the title at Mania 40 by defeating Rollins, but his reign would be short-lived as Punk ruined his party, and Priest cashed in the Money in the Bank briefcase on the same night. Punk's feud with Drew McIntyre became the engine driving Raw through 2024. Their rivalry was personal in a way that felt intense even by professional wrestling standards. Their SummerSlam match, with Seth Rollins serving as special referee, was a deliberately complicated affair that left all three men with unfinished business. Their subsequent strap match at Bash in Berlin and a brutal Hell in a Cell encounter at Bad Blood in October gave the feud 3 premium live event chapters that kept the conflict escalating rather than repeating. Through 2024, Raw also witnessed one of its most striking debuts since the Wyatt family arrived in 2013. On June 17th, Bray Wyatt's brother Bo Dallas returned to WWE under the name Uncle Howdy, leading a faction called the Wyatt Six, comprised of Eric Rowan, Dexter Lumis, Joe Gacy, and Nikki Cross, each embodying characters from Bray's beloved Firefly Funhouse. The debut, with eerie music playing, Bray's lantern being reclaimed, and the characters walking out as living human beings, was one of the most emotionally loaded Raw moments in years. The group brought supernatural menace to a brand that had been missing that particular texture since The Fiend's best days. This era of Raw also saw Gunther win the World Heavyweight Championship and cement himself as a dominant force on Monday nights. LA Knight remained the most organically overstar on Raw, despite never winning a world title. Rhea Ripley and Liv Morgan got into a personal feud with the involvement of Dominic Mysterio, making it one of the most entertaining stories on Raw during this period. Also on the road to WrestleMania 40, Raw produced one of its wildest segments ever, when The Rock beat up Cody Rhodes in the rain. And then came January 6th, 2025, and Raw moved to Netflix. The premiere episode from the Intuit Dome in California aired in front of a sold-out crowd of 17,000 and an audience of millions, streaming globally for the first time. The Rock appeared. John Cena officially kicked off his retirement tour. The Undertaker showed up. Seth Rollins faced CM Punk in a match that the company had built for weeks. The show was everything a debut episode needs to be. Triple H called it the Netflix era, and for a few weeks it felt like the dawn of an exciting period. John Cena's retirement tour remained one of the dominant Raw stories through the first months of 2025, but not in the way anyone expected. At the Elimination Chamber pay-per-view in March, Cena won the chamber match and earned a WrestleMania title shot, then immediately turned heel for the first time since 2003 by attacking Cody Rhodes and aligning with The Rock and Travis Scott. The moment was shocking, but the follow-through failed to live up to the hype. During his reign, Cena feuded with Punk, Randy Orton, and R-Truth, with the bulk of most of these stories playing out on Raw. The face of the PG era also won the Intercontinental Championship and had a brief run with the belt, before dropping it back to Dirty Dom. Cena's goodbye was received with the warmth 20 years of service deserved, even if the final months hadn't been his most creatively satisfying chapter. Through the remainder of 2025 and into 2026, CM Punk's World Heavyweight Championship reign gave Raw its primary narrative focus, with the Vision faction led by Seth Rollins looking to ruin the party. Rollins eventually won the title by cashing in his Money in the Bank briefcase, but had to relinquish it shortly after because of an injury and the Vision turning on him. Punk won the vacated title and carried Monday nights for the rest of the year. The Night 1 main event of WrestleMania 42 in Las Vegas in April 2026 saw Roman Reigns defeat Punk to claim the World Heavyweight title, a changing of the guard that immediately set up new directions, with Jacob Fatu emerging as a potential challenger for Reigns' title and the post-WrestleMania Raw in Las Vegas planting seeds for the stories that will define the next chapter of the show. The women's division is loaded with stars like Liv Morgan and Becky Lynch, along with newcomers like Sol Ruca. We've also got an exciting mid-card with names like Penta, Ethan Page, and Dirty Dom. Where Raw goes from here is yet to be seen. The Netflix deal has given the show its broadest international platform in 32 years of existence. The roster has depth, from the established names like Punk, Reigns, and Rollins, through to emerging stars like Braun Breaker and Oba Femi, who feel like they were built for exactly this stage. The show that started in a 1,000-seat ballroom in New York is now streamed live to every country on Earth every Monday night. Raw has been the loudest, messiest, most compelling, most frustrating, and most consistently talked about weekly television program in wrestling history. And 33 years in, that conversation shows no sign of ending anytime soon.